Thank you and hello. I have called this talk 5 Easy Pieces. I thought I would talk about 5 pieces that have influenced me and see what thought they generated. See if there was a link between them and see what my thoughts about them are now and if they've changed at all over the years. I want to start by discussing what is perhaps my favourite musical era in music. I say era, but it is a mere 10 years. It's the decade from 1905 to 1915. The dates are sort of arbitrary in that you could choose 1900 to 1914, and that would be the start of the decade to the start of the war. But I chose 1905 to 1915 as it's a nice round decade. If you remember the centenary of the Anzac commemorations, that was 10 years ago. At the beginning of the 20th century, the floodgates opened creatively for so many composers, and many works from that time have established themselves in the concert repertoire. It is fascinating to examine why this creative outburst occurred and why so many works remain in the repertoire. Here is just a sample from that decade, and remember all of these pieces are still in the repertoire today. There's Debussy with La Mer and Jeu and his remarkable piano preludes, Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe and the Rhapsody Espagnole, Sibelius' Symphony 3, 4 and 5, Mahler's Symphony 7, 8 and 9 and the unfinished 10th, and Das Lied von der Erde, Strauss's operas Salome, Elektra and Rosenkavalier, plus Alpine Symphony, Schoenberg's Chamber Symphony, 5 orchestral pieces, Piero Lunaire and Erwartung, Berg's 3 pieces for orchestra and a start on the opera Wozzeck, Bartók's Bluebeard's Castle and his first and second string quartets, Holst's The Planets, Ives' Unanswered Question, Central Park in the Dark, 3 places in New England, Puccini's Madame Butterfly, plus works by Janacek, Elgar, Rachmaninoff and Scriabin. I think you'll agree it's an incredibly fertile decade. A lot of the composers aren't from Germany. America, England, France, Finland, Hungary, Italy and Russia all have entrants in the list. It's a fascinating time in history and it is worth talking about how it came to be. To do this, I need to talk about the demise of tonal harmony. Tonal harmony or functional harmony was a hierarchical harmonic system. Pieces were in a particular key, either major or minor, and this key ruled over all others. It was the stronghold of musical composition for over 300 years. Harmony reigned supreme over all other musical parameters, rhythm, melody, structure and so on. Over the course of its lifetime, composers stretched and manipulated it by pushing it to its limits chromatically and by delaying resolution to the home key. In the opera Tristan and Isolde, for example, Wagner famously delays any sense of resolution to the home key through continuous chromatic suspension, making the music feel unanchored. I was recently talking with Wazo violinist Zach Roundtree, who told me that he used to play Mozart quartets at weddings. And for a laugh, the players would drop every 4th bar, and in doing so eradicate cadences to the tonic key. He said this made the music sound like Wagner. The takeaway message is obviously not to book Zach for weddings. All this stretching and delaying meant that harmony's power was weakening. By the end of the 19th century, it was no longer able to support the expressive demands for composers, and it gave way. The floodgates were open and music burst forth into many tributaries. It's important to note that tonal harmony was dominated by German composers. Just think of the lineage Bach, Haydn, Mozart, Schubert, Schumann, Beethoven, Wagner and Brahms. So at this pivotal moment in music history, a great deal of composers who took music in new directions were not German. In fact, German composers were convinced that carrying on with a supersaturated chromaticism, with or without a tonal hierarchy, was the way to go. Mahler, Strauss, and then Schoenberg, Webern and Berg all carried this tradition forward. So when tonal harmony collapsed, rather than not knowing what to do next, there was a profound and monumental burst of creativity. Composers looked at other parameters for structural guidance, and the fact that they were so successful and in such a small time frame is amazing. If Debussy wanted to use a 7th chord, it was not encumbered by the laws of tonal harmony to resolve. Oh, sorry. It was not encumbered. It could hang in the air like perfume. He had admired Wagner deeply, but concluded that there was no future in carrying on and developing this style. Debussy made a wonderful comment that Wagner was a beautiful sunset that was mistaken for a dawn. For the incredibly observant, you would have noticed a huge omission from my list. The most important and influential composer for me, and I think it's fair to say the world, was Stravinsky and his 3 ballets. Firebird from 1908, Petrushka from 1911, and The Rite of Spring from 1913, which is my first piece. If this talk was a desert island disc and I had to choose 5 pieces to be stranded on an island with, then The Rite of Spring would definitely be on it. Nerdily, I would want the score as well, as this piece is the gift that keeps on giving. It is considered a revolution in rhythmic invention, and it is, but its adventure in harmony, form and orchestration were equally as pioneering and still resonate today. Stravinsky was a virtuoso when it came to orchestration and had supreme confidence in instrumental writing. The excerpt I'm about to play is called Glorification of the Chosen One. Consonance and dissonance are the yin and yang of harmony, stability and instability. Stravinsky takes this concept and applies it to rhythm, where regular steady pulse is akin to consonance and rhythmic discombobulation relates to dissonance. In this excerpt we hear rhythmic dissonance from the outset. The orchestra is charged with irregular rhythms and displaced accents. The rhythmic consonance comes in the form of a vamp, the steady oompa-oompa pulse that is laden with expectation. The coup is how he made the orchestra sound like one giant instrument. It feels as though the orchestra is coming after you, and once it grabs you, you can't imagine what's going to happen. The creative avalanche of the first part of the 20th century was cut short by the start of World War I. It effectively ended Europe as the centre of the musical universe. Of course, there are European giants that emerged after the war. For example, Messiaen, Ligeti, Stockhausen, Luboslavsky. But the 20th century really belongs to America. Many new musical genres emerged from the US, including but not limited to jazz and its proponents like Duke Ellington, Oscar Peterson and Miles Davis, the classical sound of Americana, exemplified by Aaron Copland and Charles Ives, experimental and chance approaches of John Cage and Morton Feldman, music theatre and the American songbook such as Gershwin, Cole Porter, Bernstein and Sondheim. Popular genres emerged such as rock, R&B, hip-hop. There was film music, which isn't really a genre, but it was exemplified in America. Bernard Herrmann, who's attached with the Hitchcock movies, Carl Stalling, who did the music for the Bugs Bunny cartoons, and John Williams, who wrote the music for Jaws, Indiana Jones, E.T., Superman, Harry Potter, and Star Wars. I had a conversation with some first years just last week, and they were trying to guess my 5 pieces for this talk. And their first guess was the music to Star Wars, and I said, no, it's not on the list. And one of them responded, well, you're not being true to yourself. And these are people that I've known for about 9 weeks. It is true that seeing Star Wars for the first time as an 11-year-old was life-changing, and I was one of the several billion kids that became obsessed with it. And that's probably because watching movies and listening to music was nothing like it is now. The phrase straight to video did not exist in 1977. You had to go to the movies or watch whatever was on TV on Sunday night. Similarly, when you paid for music, you bought a physical item. So the connection to that piece of music would be strong and immediate. You got the vinyl, you got the liner notes, and you got the artwork. In many cases, the book and the record might be the only way into the movie outside of seeing it at the cinema. And John Williams' score is essentially what drew me to becoming a composer. Of course, now I can safely say that a great deal of the music to Star Wars has been inspired by The Rite of Spring. So piece 2 is not Star Wars. The other genre that emerged from America during the 20th century was minimalism. This includes the music of Steve Reich, Philip Glass and John Adams. The first work I heard by Adams was The Chairman Dancers, and I was drawn in by its American-sounding harmony, and by that I mean the open quartal harmony of the chords that Copeland and Reich had capitalised upon, and the dazzling orchestration, high-string harmonics that ping out with glockenspiels, guitars and bowed vibraphone against a choking background. This work led me to Harmony Lehrer from 1985. This three-movement symphony in everything but name melds minimalism with late romantic gestures. It's hard not to hear Mahler, Sibelius and Wagner in this piece. The excerpt I'm about to play is the last couple of minutes. It demonstrates a particular technique of suspending the bass for a long time. So when it arrives, it causes great dramatic effect. The tonality is ambiguous, but the arrival of the low E flat cements it unequivocally. Once it arrives, the whole orchestra remains in E flat, building up in energy like a juggernaut to the final chord. With minimalism, the triad was back, but it didn't behave to the laws of functional harmony. You might be forming the picture that I really like large orchestral works that build up a massive amount of energy, and two out of two so far, that's absolutely true. That work you just heard begins with 39 E minor chords pounding out in true minimalistic fashion. These are marshalling, fanfaristic and brash, quite the opposite to the next piece. Sofia Gubaidulina was a Russian composer whose originality is striking. I can't think of a composer whose music is so off the beaten track unique. She ravers between fragile little whiffs of sound, caught in silence, and then unrestrained fury. Shostakovich advised Gubaidulina to stay on her mistaken path, advice that she cherished from her senior compatriot. The first piece of Gubaidulina's I heard was Offertorium, which is a violin concerto. It opens by quoting King Frederick's theme from Bach's Musical Offering. Furthermore, it is orchestrated in the same technique that Webern developed. That is, melodic lines that are broken up and passed around various instruments in the orchestra like pass the parcel, a technique known as Klangfarben melody, sound colour melody. Her symphony Stimmen verstummen from 1986 means voices fall silent. It's in 12 movements that range from 30 seconds to 11 minutes. The orchestra is large and includes tons of percussion and a pipe organ. What draws me to her music is her supreme originality. Comparing this with Harmony Lehrer, written a year earlier, there is a similarity in their static use of triads. Harmony Lehrer begins with the tolling E minor chords, Stimmen verstummen, with D major. Whereas Adams is loud and brash, Gubaidulina's D major is lightly peppered on the page, and it spins its way downwards in register throughout the orchestra, until it is met with a low C-sharp major triad that appears like a scar. Visually, it reminds me of a bright orange canvas with a dark, rich blue or even black streak of paint smeared across it. Very simple materials to create a striking image. For me, this is one of those why didn't I think of that type of scores. Here is the first movement in its entirety, all 98 seconds of it. Goodbye Delina just died in March, and I found a quote of hers that says, "When I look back at my path in music, Bach and Webern lie at the centre." When I studied music here at UWA last century, I distinctly remember hearing Webern for the first time, and not getting it at best and hating it at worst. Here was music where individual movements were only a handful of bars long and contained only a handful more notes. As a child of 80s synth-pop, it was a stretch for me to begin to understand this. Cue 2011 and cue the iPod. I used to listen to a lot of music in shuffle mode, where music played randomly. And I made a lot of discoveries and rediscoveries this way. It was also interesting when unlikely pieces followed one another. Luboslavsky merging into David Bowie, for example. And this was how I rediscovered Webern. I heard the fourth movement from his 6 orchestral pieces from 1909, that decade, in a late night listening session. It's an incredibly powerful funeral march that starts with low, soft, ominous bells and builds up to deafening and terrifying shrieks. What I do understand about Webern now is that his music is distilled down to its essence. They are super condensed symphonies as if written by a lean, trimmed down but pumped up on steroids Mahler. And it was something lost entirely on 19-year-old me. Webern's influence has been huge upon other composers, like Goodbye Delina, but also Kortag and Ligeti, and even American minimalist pioneer Lamont Young. Under the Nazi regime, Webern was labelled a degenerate artist. His music entartete Musik, and all performances of his work were banned. When the war ended, he optimistically looked forward to resuming his career as a composer and conductor. In September 1945, Webern was staying at his son-in-law's house when 2 American soldiers came to the house to investigate his son-in-law's dealing on the black market. Webern was out on the balcony smoking a cigar, and one of the soldiers bumped into him in the dark, panicked, pulled his rifle out and accidentally shot Webern. Webern is not the 4th piece, by the way. There's a story. At about the same time I was disliking Webern's music, the Beatles' music was being released for the first time on CD, and I very quickly became hooked. Their songs are as broad as they are deep. They cover so many musical styles, from the early songs such as Please Please Me, with its off-kilter vocal harmonies, right through to the progressive A Day in the Life. They genuinely kept pushing themselves musically. In a few short years, the Beatles changed the direction of popular music. They gave up performing live in August 1966 and began experimenting with everything. From that point forward, they devoted all their energies to recording. They would go on to exploit the studio without having to worry about reproducing anything live. They had already introduced outside musicians to their recordings, a string quartet in Yesterday, a sitar on Norwegian wood, for example, and they had begun experimenting with recording techniques, such as backwards vocals on the song Rain, and tape loops and drones in the song Tomorrow Never Knows. Initially, the studio was a space to capture a performance. What ended up on record sounded pretty much like a live performance. By the time of the song Strawberry Fields Forever in 1967, the Beatles were using the studio itself as an instrument. They were putting vocals through rotating speakers, they were reversing tape and changing the speed, and multi-tracking it. They were even chopping up bits of tapes and reassembling it randomly to form music concrete type of tracks. This song was composed by John Lennon and credited to Lennon and McCartney, like all the Lennon-McCartney songs. It's an eclectic mix of instruments: guitar, piano, bass and drums, with trumpets and cellos. There's a sword mandel, which is an Indian harp, and a relatively new instrument, the mellotron. The mellotron was like a sampling keyboard, in that pre-recorded sounds could be played on it. Flutes, strings and choirs could be played from a piano-like keyboard, each key having an individual tape loop connected to it that was triggered when the key was pressed. Needless to say, they were cumbersome and bulky, and they kept conking out. They were soon replaced by synthesizers and samplers. Interestingly, the Musicians' Union at the time attempted to ban the mellotron, as they saw it putting real choirs and real flutes and real string ensembles out of jobs. They also tried to ban synthesizers and drum machines in the early 80s for similar reasons. Signs of things to come if we look at where we are today. This song is a great synthesis of John Lennon's imagination for lyrics and songwriting, combined with clever arrangement of the instruments. The cello and trumpet parts were done by their producer George Martin, and the inventiveness of recording techniques. Pop meets classical meets technology.
Let me take you down, 'cause I'm going to Strawberry Fields. Nothing is real, nothing to get hung about. Strawberry Fields forever. Strawberry Fields forever. Strawberry Fields forever.
As you all know, John Lennon was shot in December of 1980 outside his home in New York by a deranged fan who macabrely had asked for his autograph that very day. Having made the connection in my mind between the deaths of Lennon and Webern, I set about writing an orchestral piece for Wazo in 2011, commemorating the lives of both, called Two Memorials. In the first memorial, I evoke Webern-esque gestures through angular, highly expressive figures and evolving timbres. In Lennon's memorial, the language changes abruptly, a bit like the older iPod in shuffle mode. There are triadic harmonies, Ringo-esque drum fills, and overlaid polytonal and polyrhythmic effects. In true Beatles fashion, a sample plays excerpts from the Webern-Lennon memorial backwards over the Lennon memorial. The Decca Record Company was the company that famously turned down the Beatles when they auditioned in 1962. And in many ways it was a good thing they did, as they wouldn't have worked with George Martin. In the 90s, I lived in London and I got a job at Decca, which was at that point a classical music label only. The Decca building where I worked was on a road that intersected with Abbey Road. I know what you're thinking, I'm like the fifth Beatle, right? Yeah. So which is where the famous EMI studios are. My boss at Decca was a man named Dave Harris, who was a sound engineer at EMI in the 60s. So he had worked with the Beatles and was involved in the recording of Strawberry Fields Forever. In 2019, I worked on a project with singer-songwriter Paul Kelly. We had previously worked on an album called Conversations with Ghosts with musicians from the Australian National Academy of Music and recorder player Genevieve Lacey. This new show was called 13 Ways to Look at Birds, and it was part poetry reading, part classical gig, and part rock concert. This was a collaboration that I adored for several reasons. We toured it around the country, we made a studio recording, and I played electric guitar on it. You will notice an act of karmic symmetry in that the record label was released by Decca. I had incorporated electric guitar into a piece for Melbourne Symphony in 2016 and had become quite obsessed with the sound-making possibility using effect pedals. When the opportunity came up to do a second project with Paul Kelly, I really wanted to play electric guitar on it. But it's a well-known fact that you need 10,000 hours to achieve mastery of a certain skill. I didn't have 10,000 hours available, so I used a lot of guitar pedals in the misguided belief that the sonic wondrousness produced by the pedals would distract from my lack of playing skills. The other trick was to compose music easy enough for me to play and write difficult stuff for everybody else who had done at least 10,000 hours. So I was able to bluff my way into the group on electric guitar. Paul and I were joined by a pianist, a violinist, a cellist, a multi-instrumentalist named Alice Keith, who was also an announcer on ABC Classic FM. And she played banjo, auto harp, glockenspiel, synthesizer, and sang. We played gigs at the Perth Concert Hall, Melbourne Recital Centre, City Recital Centre in Sydney, and Taronga Zoo. The fifth piece is a song from the record called The Fly by Czech poet and immunologist Miroslav Holub. Despite being on an album about birds, the poem is centred around the eponymous fly who is watching a bloody and gory battle take place. She mates with another fly and then sits on a disemboweled horse before laying her eggs on the eye of a dead soldier. Finally, in the last line of the poem, a swift swoops down and eats it. So the poem met the bird criteria in the last line. We used some old school studio techniques with it, part inspired by the Beatles. For example, Paul's voice is put through a megaphone and the string parts are in reverse. I wrote the violin and cello parts out backwards, recorded them in the studio, then inserted those parts into the track and then reversed them back. This meant that the music was forward, but each individual tone had that backwards sucking effect. Of course, we couldn't do this live, performers had to play in the traditional forwards manner. This was one of the songs that would fall under the banner of poetry reading, as Paul doesn't sing the text. At the end of the poem, there is an instrumental reflection on what has just occurred. It starts out on solo piano, plaintive and thoughtful, trying to take in what we've just witnessed. Then the other instruments answer in such a way to suggest, yeah, that was all pretty gross.
She sat on a willow trunk, watching part of the Battle of Crécy. The shouts, the gasps, the groans, the trampling and the tumbling. During the 14th charge of the French cavalry, she mated with a brown-eyed male fly from Vadencourt. She rubbed her legs together as she sat on a disemboweled horse, meditating on the immortality of flies. With relief, she alighted on the blue tongue of the Duke of Clairvaux. When silence settled, and only the whisper of decay softly circled the bodies, and only a few arms and legs still twitched jerkily under the trees. She began to lay her eggs on the single eye of Johann Ur, the royal armourer. And thus it was that she was eaten by a swift, fleeing from the fires of her strays.
In 2019, the Guardian newspaper released a list of what it considers to be the best 25 classical works of the 21st century. And remember, this list is arbitrary, opinionated and biased, like all lists of this nature. It includes works by Steve Reich, Harrison Birtwistle, John Adams, not to be confused with John Luther Adams, who was also on the list, Louis Andriessen, who died in 2021, Kaya Sariahu, who died in 2023, and Georgi Kortag, who turns 100 in February. There's Thomas Addis, George Benjamin, Unsuk Chin, Linda Catlin-Smith, James McMillan, Max Richter, Rebecca Saunders, Carolyn Shaw, Jennifer Walsh, and Brett Dean, who is from Queensland. It is a broad and varied list of musical styles, from operas to high-tech string quartets, as equally broad as my list of 1905 to 1915. How much of it will endure, though? Number one on the list was a song cycle called Let Me Tell You by Danish composer Hans Abrahamsen, a piece that conductor Simon Rattle is convinced will be played to our grandchildren. The musical explosion that occurred before World War I was triggered by a quantum shift in music. We are certainly in the middle of a quantum shift today, but it's more to do with the dissemination of music rather than the music itself. The internet makes it possible for us to listen to any piece of music from anywhere and any time, instantly, for free. The barriers that were once so fortified between classical and pop music have eroded. Ultimately, these are all good things. Conversely, this new platform has fragmented the landscape so much that it's impossible to keep up with it. The internet sprays us with information and misinformation. Recently, I saw a songwriter on YouTube refer to themselves as a creativer. This suggests to me that there will be more composers with smaller audiences. The internet does make it incredibly easy for us to get our music out there. However, I'm not sure there will be gatekeepers anymore. Figures like Stravinsky, who was genuinely world famous, will no longer exist. I'm glad he did though, because we got John Williams. Thank you.
Jim's just telling me that I ruined one of his lines.
That's okay.
So,
Has anyone got any questions or something? Have we got time or is it?
we do have time. I'm not sure I can see anyone out there, but are there any questions from the audience? It's a lecture after all. Anyone have anything they'd like to add? I'd like to start by saying, of course I've known James for a very long time now.
Since the 1730s, I believe.
When I knew you at school, of course you were a horn player. What turned you into a composer?
It was not knowing exactly what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to be involved in music, but French horn was not the right fit for me. And when I see French horn players in orchestras now, I know that I made the right choice. And music players out there. Oh, this looks like, just to have this kind of effort and concentration on their lips and for it to all go horribly wrong in an instant, it's just... There's other ways for things to go horribly wrong.
So I'm a brass player, so I know what that feels like. Do we have any questions from the house? Anyone like to ask a question?
I've got a question.
Up the back there.
Hi Jim, thanks, that was a great talk. I'm wondering whether you could talk a little bit, sort of following on with where you ended with this idea of no longer mainstream and all of these different styles and breaking down barriers between classical and pop, which was such a strong theme when we used to use. How do you see that play into your role as a teacher, as somebody who's nurturing the next generation of composers? Because what I always find admirable and striking about these composition student events here is how your students all sound different from each other, which I think is a really great thing.
Thank you, Cecilia. I can't see them. When I was studying here, I didn't do composition, but I was aware of that if I was to take composition, all I'd be doing would be writing 12-tone rows. And 12-tone music I think, has had its day. I think it's a system, but it takes away a lot of expressive control from the composer. So I kind of didn't want to do that, and I kind of rebelled against wanting to do that because I just found it really uninteresting. And as I say, it was this music of probably John Adams when I was working at Decca, that I heard for the first time, that showed me there was another way. You didn't have to write this music that was, unapproachable perhaps. Even today, when you say, if an audience sees a banner that says new music concert, it causes conniptions. It still, even today, it still does that. So I just want to make sure that the students are using their imagination more than anything. And because it's about what you're saying as a composer, not so much can you write a 12-tone row. Can we leave this at home? Have I left you? Is the dinner burning or something?
It's interesting hearing you talk about music in a way that I don't get to hear you talk about at home, so I'm going to ask you a question that you can answer at home. And I guess that's around you've grouped people together, and it sounds like these composers have influenced other composers. So you talked about Stravinsky, and then you talked about Bernard Herrmann, who I feel like, clearly Bernard Herrmann was influenced by Stravinsky, not the other way around.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm interested to hear how does it work? How can you hear a piece but make it your own, but still hear another composer in it? So, that example is quite clear, I think, but it's still his own voice. Bernard Herrmann's voice is still his own voice, but you can hear Stravinsky in it.
That's a very good question, darling. No, look, you don't write music in a bubble. Obviously, the only way you write music is by hearing music. And the more music that you expose yourself to, the more ideas and that you steal and absorb into your own work. Stravinsky has actually been attributed with saying, good composers borrow, great composers steal. And obviously, if you write something, a composer is clear of anything that they might be referencing or where they got these ideas from, but hopefully there's more than one idea to sort of disguise it. It's like stealing. You steal from lots of different shops and you end up with a lot of money or jewellery or whatever, but no one's really missing anything. But that's Can we finish this at home?
I have a
Bill.
Gilbert. At the end of your lecture, you talked about the sort of, in a sense, the destruction of the mechanism of dispersal. Does that mean that a lot of the music we will hear in the future will lack the discipline and the depth of knowledge of composers we all hear and love and have heard and loved to date?
Well, that is a very good question also, because it's hard to tell the genuine artist from the charlatan with the spray that we get on the internet. And to me, the only judge of this is time. If we're still playing these pieces in 100 years, then I think we know the answer to that question. But I can't see any other way at the moment. I mean, obviously someone that refers to themselves as a creator is perhaps... I didn't click on this person's channel, by the way, just because of that. So yeah, it is difficult to, sort the wood from the trees, if that's the right expression. And again, only time will tell. I think it was kind of telling that Simon Rattle predicts this Hans Abrahamson piece will be one of the pieces that we do play in the future. But there's this thing about music that you can't define. It's not necessarily luck, but it's just a whole connection, stream of things that gets a piece played at a certain time. I mean, I'm not taking anything away from Stravinsky's genius, but there was lots of things that happened that got him to that point where he met Diaghilev and wrote those ballets. And, you know, there might have been a Stravinsky too in the wings who never got that opportunity. I mean, the Beatles as well. The Beatles are clearly greater than the sum of their parts, I reckon. When the four of those got together, the musicianship and the music was wonderful, and yet, as individuals, nothing sort of has come on that level, I don't think. So, was that close to answering?
No, but very interesting.
Let's get one more, shall we? I can see a couple up the back. Sterling.
List of 5 might seem quite limited. Did you have certain pieces that you cut from your selection? And if so, why were they cut?
Well, Sterling is one of those first year students that was trying to find out what the 5 pieces were last week. I don't think it was he that said that I'm not being true to myself, but yeah, it was really hard to get it down to 5, and it wasn't my desert island disc. I certainly wouldn't want to be on an island with those pieces necessarily. I chose them because of the thread, you know, the Webern connecting John Lennon in my mind, and then the Beatles connecting the recording techniques that we kind of used on the Paul Kelly project. Good Lord, I've forgotten what your question was, Sterling.
It was about ones that you maybe considered.
Oh, that didn't make it to the...
Ultimately didn't.
Oh yeah, okay, so look, I guess Star Wars was on the list because it was so influential to me as a young person, but it was influential at a stage when I wasn't a composer as such. And, you know, you've got to go to the source in these things. A lot of the Star Wars soundtrack, as great as I think it is, it does, you know, they made that film and they cut it to the Rite of Spring and they cut it to the planets and to Dvorak's Symphony No. 9 and these sort of things. So that's why you hear those references in there, because John Williams was given that music to refer to. But the connection about the Rite of Spring to Bernard Herrmann, for example, is also an interesting one. Where Stravinsky was an anti-romantic in that you don't have these, you know, sweeping, grandiose violin lines or whatever. They're all angular and rhythmic and discombobulated and so on. And a lot of European composers, because Bernard Herrmann, the Hitchcock composer, was an Austrian that emigrated to America, so there was a lot of European immigrants who got into film music, and I think you go with the last thing that you know, and I think the Rite of Spring had made a big impact, you know, at the start of the century.
So I've known James for a very long time, and the works that you produce are always so interesting and so varied across your career so far. And I find that amazing. There's so much growth in you as a composer that we hear through your music. And that makes it wonderful to always hear another work by yours. I can't tell you how much Conversations with Ghosts was such a fantastic work for me to hear live. I can still remember hearing that in concert hall. And Jenny Lacey and Paul Kelly and you, and it was just amazing creativity that oozes from your work. But it was wonderful to hear these 5 pieces tonight, and a lovely Callaway lecture this evening. Thank you so much, James.